Thank you for having me. I'm Paul Froese. I'm a sociologist at Baylor University. I'm also the director of the Baylor Religion Surveys, which is a national survey that looks specifically at religion, but a lot of other things. And we've been doing that national survey since 2005. And so we have the 6 waves of the survey. And I'll present some of the data from the last wave today. I also study kind of religious repression around the world. I've done work on how religion affects people's sense of purpose and whether they feel like they matter in the world. But today I'm going to talk about another kind of area of research that I do, which is how images of God relate to kind of moral worldviews and kind of political opinions. I think the idea that kind of the God that you believe in is a reflection of you on some level has been around for a long time. I remember reading in a theology journal from the 19th century a line that said, the savage man has a savage God. And so that kind of illustrates that idea. I think in the 20th century, it became a little bit more sophisticated, with psychologists thinking about how people believe in God and their relationships with God would be somehow mirroring how they related to other people, maybe also mirroring how they related to their parents as children. I was, in thinking on this topic, I was kind of drawn to a group of literature, which I guess I'll classify as kind of moral foundations theory. Which thinks about that people have kind of core moral ideas about the world, and then these kind of can predict all the kind of specific preferences and attitudes you have. Specifically, James Hunter, who wrote the book Culture Wars, has this idea that people are kind of distinct in terms of progressives think of morality as coming from the individual. Whereas traditionalists, he calls them, morality kind of comes from the collective. I was also interested in the work of George Lakoff, who talked about how conservatism is really about a strict father morality versus liberalism is about a kind of a nurturant parent morality. And I was kind of captivated by this literature, and I thought, well, how do you measure a person's moral worldview? And it brought me back to this idea of, well, maybe if you ask people about what they think about God, this is really a kind of a reflection of how they understand morality, authority, and justice. And so really, my interest was in talking about God, which I think a lot of people can talk about conversationally in a way that maybe is more difficult than talking about your moral worldview. You're getting insights into all these other things. So with that, let me kind of share with you my slides. So I want to talk about images of God and economic justice. I think that was an interest of David, so that's what I'm focusing in on today. The first thing, and I kind of want to spend a little bit of time on this, is how do you kind of measure people's opinions about God? And Andrew Greeley, who was a Roman Catholic priest and a sociologist, was kind of the first to start to ask questions about God on survey research back in the 60s and 70s. He kind of had, in his mind, he was trying to figure out to what extent people thought of God as a father versus a mother, and he thought that could be descriptive in terms of how they thought about the world. And so I kind of took him as an example. And first off, God is a word, at least the way we're thinking about it in terms of survey research. And so we're trying to ask people to define it for us. And when I was first developing God questions on the Baylor Religion Survey back in 2004, I actually asked for help from seminarians. But one of the problems I had was that they asked these very complicated questions, which were very interesting to ponder, but I knew that they wouldn't work on in a survey, especially for the general population. I mean, one thing you have to keep in mind is when we write surveys for the general population, they have to be at maybe like a 6th or 7th grade level. The wording has to be very simple. The concepts have to be pretty simple. And you have to realize that research has showed us that even people who are highly religious, in the general population, maybe they don't read the Bible very much, or they maybe don't kind of have, or at least they don't have the language to kind of express their theology very deeply. And so that's all something you have to keep in mind. So we created hundreds of questions about God. And through analysis, we kind of came up with around 30 questions that showed variation within the population in terms of how they answered these questions. And if you can take this God test, if you go to the ARDA, and it will kind of show you how you get categorized based on these questions. But again, I want to stress this is a very blunt instrument, right? This isn't getting at the deep spiritual lives of people. It's really just kind of showing variation in the population of how they answer these questions. So what do we find? Well, variation is limitless, of course. I definitely found when I did interviews with people to kind of follow up on the survey data, people's images of God tend to be very idiosyncratic, right? They're very kind of specific to them. And this might be more of a modern phenomenon where individuals talk or in prayer, they are communicating with God. And so they kind of create this very kind of personalized interaction. And so their gods tend to be very specific to them. But in terms of the general population, what we found on these survey questions, there's 2 general dimensions that showed variation. One was the extent to which people felt that God was engaged with them and the world. And so this kind of is, does God feel close to you, caring, active in the world? And so you can think of this as kind of a continuum where at one end, God is kind of distant and not there. And the other end, God is very present, always kind of active in your world. And our items actually match very similar to items developed by psychologists that are often referred to as an attachment to God scale. So it's kind of how close you feel to God. And God's engagement, these variables are highly correlated with how often you pray, if you go to church. So they are correlated with kind of general measures of religiosity and spirituality. The other dimension we found is kind of, to what extent is God judging us, or does God feel wrathful or critical or punishing to the person? And again, we found variation in this. This dimension is less predictive of, let's say, church attendance or prayer, but there's a lot of research that shows this dimension is highly correlated with views about criminal justice, which I won't talk about today, but I'm happy to in our kind of Q&A. So from those 2 dimensions, we created these kind of 4 types of God. And so at the upper end here, you have this dimension of engagement. So more engaged. So these are kind of people who think God is very active in their lives. You have these kind of 2 different types, authoritative God and benevolent God. And what distinguishes them is this dimension, judgment. So the authoritative God people will say, well, yes, God is very active. And in fact, God can even punish people in this world. So, I talked to people in interviews that said, well, my cousin's an alcoholic, and I think that is God punishing him for past sins, right? And so this idea that God actually does negative things to us in this world, but that would be different from people who believe in the kind of benevolent God, who wouldn't say, well, no, this alcoholism isn't because God is putting this on them, but in fact, maybe God is going to be the force that helps them out of it. And so you have this kind of distinction here. And then on the lower end here, you have people who believe in a less engaged God. Probably the most interesting dimension here is this kind of critical God person, where God is judgmental and wrathful, but really not active in the world. So you imagine this idea that maybe God's wrath, you'll incur in the afterlife, but you're not seeing it here. So injustice maybe prevails in this world, but it won't in the next. Versus this kind of distant God, where I think people who believe in a distant God is maybe a kind of loving force in the universe, but doesn't really have specific characteristics that they could talk about other than that. And so this is a kind of a more, I don't know, I guess a more secularized version of God. And then how these gods relate to politics, which is something that I'm very interested in, is in a very general sense. Authoritative gods are related to kind of more right-wing, kind of conservative politics, whereas distant gods are kind of more related to left-wing liberal politics. And so let's get into more specifics on that topic. Well, actually, before I get there, I'm just going to show you just how these gods are distributed by some dimensions. The first is your kind of religious type. And so in the survey, what you do is we can classify people in terms of what church they belong to. And so the people who have no religion, this is kind of a meaningless category because you have so many different groups grouped here, you can't really interpret this. Jewish, Roman Catholic, mainline Protestant, and then here we have evangelical Protestant, Black Protestant, and researchers, I haven't done this, but other researchers have determined because there has been historically a difference between white evangelical churches and Black evangelical churches, it makes sense to make them distinct in terms of what church you belong to. Now, this doesn't mean you can have African Americans belonging to predominantly white evangelical churches and whites belonging to Black Protestant churches, but these are kind of churches. And so what you see here is people with no religion, as you would expect. There's a fair amount of atheists, but a lot of them believe in God still. Other, I said, it's kind of a meaningless category. Jewish, you see there is a distribution, but a lot of distant God people here and atheists. But if we look just at these kind of Christian groups, what's interesting is Roman Catholics and mainline Protestants look very similar in terms of their answers to these God questions, pretty evenly distributed here. And they look distinct from evangelical Protestants and Black Protestants, in particular, in terms of authoritative God. Here you have a large percentage of evangelical Protestant, Black Protestants believing in authoritative gods, much less so here. And then also in terms of distant God, you have much more people in Catholic churches, mainline Protestant churches, who believe in distant gods. So that I think is kind of interesting, is that the image of God really vary by the kind of church you go to. And also I think you saw in this kind of distinction with churches, we had this Black Protestant churches is, I'm looking at racial differences in image of God. And what's interesting here is Blacks really come out as have a high percentage having authoritative God. And we can kind of maybe talk about this in our Q&A. But one possibility here is, and we could look at this cross-culturally, is that maybe groups that are historically oppressed might kind of imagine God as more judgmental because they see injustice in the world and maybe feel like, well, God should be angry about that. So I think God is angry about those kinds of things. But this also, I'm showing you these kind of racial differences because they'll affect how our data looks later, is because there are these kind of intervening effects, race effects, political effects on how gods interact with political opinions. So income differences, I won't spend much time here. There's not a lot of income differences, just in general. People who make over $100,000 a year are maybe a little bit more likely to be atheists, agnostics, but still a lot of believers and distribution here. And people who make under $35,000 a year are maybe less likely to be atheists, agnostics. But not more likely to be authoritative gods. And kind of, actually, there's a high percentage of benevolent God believers in this group. I think where you see a lot of differences is political divide. So here we have Democrats, Independents, Republicans. Clearly, Democrats, you have almost a third that are in this kind of atheist agnostic group, but still the majority of Democrats believe in God, but you see kind of an equal distribution here. Independents, kind of equal distribution. And then, of course, with Republicans, you get this very high percentage of authoritative God believers. Now, again, this you start to see the intersectionality of things, whereas you have Republicans have this high percentage of belief in authoritative gods, but so do African Americans, who tend not to be Republican. And so you can have these kind of different things occurring. But this, I think, slide is important because I think it explains some of the findings that I'll show you next. Let me think if I want to say anything. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say about this slide, and this could be part of our discussion, is there's some very interesting work right now that is showing that Americans' religious attitudes and religious behaviors might be driven by their partisanship. So, for instance, Democrats are more likely to kind of undersell their religiosity on surveys, whereas Republicans tend to oversell their religiosity on surveys. And I think because there's a kind of popular perception that to be liberal means to be more secular and to be conservative means to be more religious. And there's a very interesting book by Michelle Margolis, which shows that young adults tend to form their political identities, and that then in turn begins to form their religious identities. And so she's kind of reversing what we might think of as the causal pattern of kind of religious values inform your political life. She's saying, no, it's your kind of partisanship starts to inform how you will look religiously, which I think is a very interesting and in some sense scary dynamic in the US. And so finally, here we get to some actual questions about economic justice. Now, one thing I want to point out on this slide is that these are all policies that are related to the federal government. And I think that becomes important. And so there are questions of, should government provide health insurance? Should the government reduce income differences? Should the government give free college tuition, reduce racial disparities, and provide reparations for kind of racial injustices? You see a clear trend in each of these questions where people with a kind of a distant God and atheist agnostics are much more supportive of these kinds of federal programs. Whereas people who believe in kind of this more engaged God are less likely overall. Now, one possibility here is that maybe people with more engaged gods don't like the federal government for some reason, or think that that poverty and social problems should be fixed through other routes other than just kind of the federal government. So that could be a reason why you have these lower percentages here. Also, maybe distant God atheist agnostics kind of see government as maybe the stand-in for, you know, God in some sense in terms of authority. But I know that David was worried that this data means, oh my goodness, that believing in kind of engaged gods means you're very anti efforts to reduce poverty. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because we can start to peel back this data in different ways. And so one way to do that, and let me spend a little time explaining this figure, is we can start to look at how images of God affect groups within groups, right? So within Democrats, within independents, within Republican groupings. And on this axis, you see, this is the engagement of God, right? This isn't the four gods. This is just on the high end. This would be people who think God is very caring and loving and close to them. The the low end, this would be kind of more distant God people. And then on this axis is answers to this question: is it very important to take care of the sick and needy if one wishes to be a good person? So here there's no reference to the federal government, right? It's just, should you as an individual, to be a good person, be taking care of sick and needy people? And what we find here is a very strong association that as a person's belief in God changes, so as they believe God is more caring, more engaged, more close to them, all groups start to think, oh, well, to be a good person, in fact, you reduce the partisan divide there. And so I think this is a kind of a strong argument that having kind of a more loving or engaged God really does change your opinion about what you should be doing and how you should be addressing issues of poverty. Here, I kind of have a similar analysis, but here is a question that specifically references the federal government. So do you agree that the federal government should distribute wealth more evenly? Again, you have the engaged God axis. And then on this axis is this question. So the higher means yes, the federal government should distribute wealth more evenly. And what we find here is Democrats overall just agree with this. And so it doesn't really matter what their religiosity or their belief about gods are. Here you have this weird independent effect. I don't know what's going on here, but I think what's more important, but there are not many people in this group, so you can have some weird stuff. But for Republicans overall, you do see a positive effect. They don't get to the point where Democrats are, but Republicans with more engaged gods tend to feel like the federal government should do something about wealth inequality. And then finally, I have a question about racial justice. So this is agreeing that the federal government, again, it's a question about the government, should improve the standard of living for ethnic minorities. That was the wording of the question. Higher means yes, lower means no again. And again, we see this strong Republican effect. As we have more engaged God, they're more likely to support this kind of thing. But then you see kind of a negative effect for Democrats. And I'm kind of wondering about people's reaction to that, what's going on there. It could be that church-going Democrats are more likely to, or just slightly less likely to support that. That's kind of an interesting dynamic. So all of these kind of figures and slides, I think, start to show that, well, first, there is this finding that atheists, agnostics, and believers in a distant God are more supportive of economic justice overall. And so that's a kind of an interesting thing. Why is that? But belief in an engaged God, which is also, psychology measures these with attachment to God, and I've used those measures, the same thing comes out, significantly increases economic justice support for conservatives, members of the GOP. And kind of my final comments here are that I think engaged God, or feeling that God is close and loving and caring, does promote compassion for the poor. I think those two things are related. But I think also other things can promote compassion for the poor. And so clearly there's kind of a secular humanism that is attached to care for the poor in this survey data. And other things can detract from this association we're finding. So for instance, partisanship and kind of beliefs that or maybe kind of anti-government beliefs can kind of mitigate the effect that images of God have on how people understand poverty.